Hi, everybody. Happy Thursday. I want to share with you a kind of success story that I heard about recently with a client in a one-on-one call. And so we'll call this boy Kyle, had a lot of developmental delays. He had, learning difficulties, reading difficulties, behavior issue. A lot of people said that he, seemed to have the emotional maturity of someone like several years younger than him. And he also had speech difficulty. So there was a lot going on. So when I started working with Kyle, what we started doing was obviously, the nutrition, like as many of you know I do, but we also started working on a really targeted movement intervention program because, as you know, there's a huge link between that and brain development and reading and so forth. And Mom reached out to say that we are now like 4 months in, and Kyle's speech has improved, his gross motor skills, his fine motor skills, his reading, his emotional maturity. Is everything perfect? No, we're only 4 months in and Kyle has a lot of difficulties. But Mom is blown away by how much the movement has, once we started adding that, and how much that has really started creating gains. And I just feel like that's something we just do not talk about enough or emphasize enough. In learning, even though there's so much research to support it, that if we move towards correction as opposed to compensation, that's what the results are going to be. And the science is showing, the research, and this is decades and decades of, this isn't new science, it's just finally getting out there, is that children with learning disabilities have immature brain development. They have less connections. They have typically low muscle tone. A lot of them have either fine or gross motor skill difficulties, and sometimes it's not really obvious. It's just kind of minor. And so someone might say, well, my son is really good at sports, but there's other little glitches and so forth that are occurring because the brain is, and that's affecting the brain development and so forth. So what was actually found, and I think I've mentioned this before, right, is that kids have brains that are several years younger, and there's many causes to this. Environmental toxicity for sure plays a huge role, but also the biggest factor is that the body and early movement builds the brain. And you might be thinking, well, my child developed fine. All it takes is them to miss a few milestones, miss one milestone, not to go through a milestone perfectly. A person who's really well versed in this, one of the leading experts in the world on childhood development and disorders, Dr. Malilo, talks how even a child delaying by a month or two of certain milestones can result in pretty significant difficulties and discrepancies and so forth. So it's not always about, again, I just like to emphasize what you didn't do or something. It's just these little glitches that can occur. And there's many reasons that it can happen, and it can go as far back as in utero. But the bottom line, what's so interesting, is that learning and movement is processed in the same part of the brain. So processes like ordering and timing and sequencing is known to be off in a lot of kids with learning difficulties, very common with dyslexia. Prediction is another aspect in terms of movement, right? And that will create clumsiness, and that could be even minor with like difficulty with handwriting and so forth. And what's interesting is all of these things are used by the motor system first, right? To be able to predict, sequence, order, time our movements. And that's the same thing that impacts our learning ability, the cognition, the processing speed, all of that type of stuff, even the prediction or the timing of the eye movements or the auditory processing that occurs in the brain. All of this is dependent upon that timing, that sequencing, ordering, all of that type of stuff. So whether it is mental or cognitive, whether it is motor, the cerebellum, which is the part of the brain, right, that is involved with this movement and learning, is making these predictive and corrective actions that lead to optimal body and brain development. So the bottom line is that movement is to the brain as water is to plants. For sure, we need the nutrients, and I've talked about gut healing and so forth, but we really need that movement. And there's so much talk now, thank God, about nutrition and the role of gut health and all that, but not enough talk about the missing piece of the puzzle. And so often people that I work with will tell me that, they worked on nutrition, their diet's amazing, and 100%, they tell me what they eat. I can tell their kids well nourished. And so that's where it's so frustrating, because they feel like they've done everything right. And so usually there's just weak connections for varying reasons. And that is where the movement therapy and interventions and so forth really come in. So just to kind of give you some, specifics, is understanding the brain is not a bucket. The brain is much more like a tree or an onion. It develops in layers. And if you miss a layer, it's like that foundation on a house. The foundation is going to be shaky. And like, for example, one of the first areas of the brain to develop is the vestibular system. So thinking balance, in middle ear, all that stuff that's often ADHD kids, right? And the vestibular system activates a system near the brainstem, which is crucial for attention and focus. And so often parents will reach out and say, well, he was diagnosed with ADHD or dyslexia and this other thing, like a learning disability. And often one probably more pronounced, and they're always like, we're not really sure if it's ADHD or it's a learning difficulty that's in the way, or we're not really sure if it's a learning difficulty or if it's the ADHD. And that's where the siphoning out has to happen, where if we improve the brain development and we start really getting in there, we can start figuring out what is really causing the problem, instead of trying to address and work with all of these different cookbook recipe style approaches that focus on, if a child has ADHD, you do this, if a child has dyslexia, you do this, and we're just gonna, mash all this together and be completely overwhelmed. And again, approaches that are compensations, not corrections. So really interesting. Again, I've talked about this before. I'm just gonna quickly, just to connect it again to that movement piece, is, as you know, if you've been following me for a while, balance is really crucial. Good vestibular function is really, really crucial for good learning, good reading, good focus. And if you think it's too late, or you feel like, gosh, my child's in grade 3 or they're in grade 4, maybe grade 5. Well, as you know, if you're aware of reading difficulties, when kids start hitting grade 3, grade 4, typically or traditionally the chances of them, kind of overcoming them becomes much more difficult, requires so much more time and effort. But what a 2003 study found is that children with learning disabilities in grade 3 showed a marked improvement in focus and reading once they engaged in a movement-based therapy program after only a few months, compared to the kids who were doing other traditional and conventional approaches in the school system and so forth. So many kids, as I've mentioned, with learning disabilities and, even dyslexia, have these coordination issues, have issues with dyspraxia and so forth. And it's not always diagnosed, right? Sometimes it gets missed because parents just think like they're clumsy or whatever, or it's just not that obvious. And also in this 2003 study, they found a significant improvement in dyslexic children who also engaged in this targeted movement therapy program. And what was found is that they had made gains in reading fluency, verbal fluency, semantics, dexterity, and they actually made substantial gains on the national standardized testing. Like, it was that significant, just throwing in movement therapy, nothing else. And as you know, if you've been following me, there's so many cool things we can do that go way beyond just movement therapy, which is what I do in my 6-month program, the Full Potential Formula. So the idea is to move beyond the limitations of IEPs, tutoring, remedial reading, medication. And, again, I want to reiterate, those approaches can be really helpful. They can put out fires, and they can be really helpful. For example, tutoring at the right action at the right time. If your child has an underdeveloped brain, if they have weak connections, tutoring is going to feel like an uphill battle, like they're climbing Mount Everest and they're never going to get to the top. And that's where I see so many of my clients or people who reach out to me whose child is feeling quite discouraged because they're, grade 6, grade 7. Yesterday I talked to someone whose child's in grade 9, and they are just shutting down because they are like, I am putting, 4 hours or 4 times more work, I should say, compared to my peers, and they're so much further ahead. And that will really affect your self-worth and self-esteem. So do not underestimate the power of movement. Get your kids moving at home. Obviously, the movement therapy that people like myself are trained in is very targeted and specific, and works on screening those lower brain levels and then developing them. But don't underestimate even just getting started with some kind of movement, because it will result in benefits and so forth, especially if you're making it like complex and so forth. So reach out if you want to book a clarity call, if you're interested in knowing more about my program, and if you have not already grabbed my free starter kit, the Laser Focused Learner, with some very specific movements that you can get started that is good for all of our kids' brains. Do grab that. I will post the link to that in the comments below. Thanks for watching, everybody.